The cameras were placed to track something ordinary. Routine environmental monitoring. The kind of footage that gets reviewed by one scientist, filed into a database, and never seen by anyone else. Drone passes, motion-triggered ground cameras, thermal imaging units positioned across one of the most ecologically dense and least understood environments in the Western Hemisphere. The Everglades. 1.5 million acres of subtropical wetland in the southern tip of Florida. A system so complex, so layered, and so ancient that biologists who have studied it for their entire careers will tell you plainly, we do not fully understand it. What those cameras captured was not what anyone was looking for. And when the footage was reviewed, the people who saw it first did not immediately release it. They sat with it. They ran it again. They called colleagues. Because what it showed was not just unexpected. It was the kind of thing that forces you to go back to everything you thought you understood about this ecosystem and ask whether any of it was right. This is not a story about a single strange animal on a single strange night. It is a story about what happens when an ecosystem that has been pushed past a critical threshold finally shows you what it has become. And the answer is nothing like what the models predicted. To understand what the footage reveals, you first need to understand what the Everglades actually is. Not the simplified version, but the real one. Most people, when they think of the Everglades, picture alligators and cypress trees and murky water. That picture is not wrong. It is just so incomplete that it might as well be a different place. The Everglades is not a swamp in the traditional sense. It is a river. Specifically, it is an extraordinarily slow-moving sheet of freshwater that originates near Orlando, flows south, and eventually spills into Florida Bay. The water moves at roughly 1/4 mile per day, so slow that for most of human history, people who looked at it saw standing water and assumed it was static. It is not. It is always moving. The entire system is a single, interconnected flow, and that flow is the engine that makes everything else possible. The sawgrass prairies, the tree islands, the mangrove forests at the coastline, the cypress domes, the alligator holes that function as dry season refuges for hundreds of species, all of it depends on that flow being consistent, being clean, and arriving at the right time. Change the timing, change the chemistry, redirect the water for agriculture or development. Do any of those things, and you do not just damage one part of the system, you alter the entire machine. By the early 20th century, that alteration had already begun in ways that people at the time did not fully understand. Massive drainage projects were initiated, canals were cut, water was redirected. Within a few decades, roughly half of the original Everglades had been converted to agricultural land or urban development. The remaining half was officially designated a national park in 1947. That designation was supposed to protect it. What it actually did was draw a line around a system that was already in distress and call it preserved. The problems that had been set in motion were still in motion, and they were accelerating, which is the context you need for what those cameras eventually captured. In the mid-1990s, something new appeared in the Everglades. At first, it was treated as an isolated curiosity. A few sightings, some unusual tracks in the mud, reports from hunters and fishermen that were easy to dismiss as misidentification. Then the population counts began, and the counts were alarming. Burmese pythons, native to Southeast Asia, capable of reaching lengths over 18 feet and weights exceeding 200 pounds. Not native to Florida, not native to any part of North America. Present in the Everglades in numbers that no one had seen coming, and that grew far faster than any containment effort could manage. The most widely accepted explanation for their origin is simple: the exotic pet trade. People bought these animals as juveniles when they were small and manageable, realized within a few years that they were neither, and released them. The Everglades was close, the climate was compatible, and what started as abandoned pets became something else entirely. The Everglades gave those pythons everything they needed: dense cover, abundant prey, no natural predators, no disease, and a climate warm enough year-round to sustain a tropical species that would die in a northern winter. Within 2 decades, the python population in South Florida had grown to an estimated 100,000 animals. Some researchers believe that number is still too conservative. What they did to the ecosystem in that time is documented in peer-reviewed research published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The findings were stark. In areas of the Everglades where pythons had become established, populations of medium-sized mammals had collapsed. Raccoons down by nearly 99%. Opossums down by 98%. Marsh rabbits were effectively gone. White-tailed deer populations had dropped by more than 94%. Read those numbers again. Not declined, not reduced, effectively eliminated. For years, those numbers were known inside ecological research circles and barely known anywhere else. The public conversation about the Everglades remained focused on water quality, on conservation funding, on the slow process of restoration. The python crisis existed in parallel, documented but somehow not fully integrated into the larger story of what was happening to this system. And then the cameras started capturing something that the surveys and population models had not fully prepared anyone to see. The monitoring network that produced the footage in question is not new. Remote cameras have been deployed across the Everglades and surrounding protected areas for years, used by a combination of state wildlife agencies, university research teams, and federal conservation programs. Some are fixed, some are drone-mounted, some are thermal imaging units designed to work in complete darkness. The purpose originally was population tracking. Identify what species are present, in what areas, at what densities, build a picture of how the ecosystem is functioning across a massive and largely inaccessible landscape. What the footage returned was a picture of absence. Researchers reviewing thermal imaging from large sections of interior marsh and prairie began documenting something they initially attributed to equipment error. The warm signatures that should have corresponded to the medium-sized mammal population, the raccoons, the deer, the rabbits, were not there, not reduced, not shifted to a different area, simply absent across stretches of landscape that should have been populated. Mammal activity that had been reliably present in baseline footage from just several years earlier had effectively stopped registering. When ground teams went in to verify, they found environments that functioned visually. The vegetation was present, the water was moving, the birds were in the trees, but that were operating, in a critically important sense, in silence. The mid-layer of the food web, the animals that eat plants and are eaten by larger predators, was missing. And then the motion-triggered cameras at ground level began capturing what was filling that space. Pythons. Not one or two. Dozens across multiple sites within single monitoring periods. Animals of sizes that field researchers described in documentation as difficult to process visually the first time you see them in real environment, not in captivity. 18-foot animals moving through sawgrass. 17-foot animals crossing monitoring paths in the middle of the day, not at night as conventionally expected, but in full daylight. But the detail that shifted the footage from unusual to genuinely alarming was not the number of pythons. It was the behavior. The animals being documented were not moving the way a population still in expansion moves. A population still growing and establishing spreads outward. It covers new ground. It moves. What the cameras were documenting looked different. Animals returning to the same sites repeatedly. Animals coexisting in proximity without the territorial behavior typical of solitary apex predators. What one researcher described in a public presentation as resembling more than anything else, a population that had run out of places to expand into because it had already saturated the available environment. That was the moment the implications became impossible to ignore. Here is the part that most coverage of the python problem in Florida has not fully explained, and it is the part that the new footage makes impossible to dismiss. An apex predator does not simply replace what it removes. When a predator at the top of a food chain eliminates the mid-level of that chain, the effects do not stop there. They cascade downward and upward simultaneously. Every species that depended on what was removed must now find another way to exist, and every species that was regulated by what was removed is now unregulated. Start from the bottom. The mid-sized mammals that the pythons have largely eliminated, raccoons, opossums, rabbits, were not just prey. They were ecological workers. Raccoons are omnivores that consume enormous quantities of invertebrates, amphibians, eggs, and vegetation. Their foraging behavior directly affects the density and distribution of species below them. Remove raccoons and those species, the frogs, the turtle eggs, the invertebrate populations respond. Some surge, some collapse. The balance that existed is gone. Opossums are one of the most effective natural tick control mechanisms in North American ecosystems. A single opossum can consume tens of thousands of ticks per season. They groom themselves obsessively, killing the ticks that attach to them, and through that behavior, they function as a biological check on tick populations across their entire range. In the areas where opossums have been effectively eliminated, the downstream effects on tick populations and on the diseases those ticks carry have not yet been fully measured. They will be. Move upward. The large wading birds of the Everglades, herons, egrets, wood storks, roseate spoonbills, are among the most visible and celebrated inhabitants of the system. They depend, for their reproduction, on the availability of small fish and amphibians in the shallow water of the marsh. What regulates the distribution of those fish? The structure of the vegetation. What shapes the structure of the vegetation? The foraging and behavior of the mid-sized mammals. Pull that layer out and the effects travel up to the birds, to the nesting, to the productivity of a population that conservation programs have spent decades trying to rebuild. The alligator, the Everglades' original apex predator, is now sharing that position with something it did not evolve alongside. Preliminary research has documented alligators and pythons preying on each other in roughly equal outcome encounters, meaning neither is reliably dominant over the other. Two apex predators now occupying the same space in a system that evolved with only one. The competitive dynamics between them are not yet understood. What the new footage documents across multiple sites and multiple monitoring periods is a system that is visibly reorganizing itself around a new dominant force. Not in crisis the way crisis is usually depicted, not with visible die-offs and dramatic collapses, but quietly, through absence, through the slow replacement of what was there with something new, through a silence where there used to be movement. And the researchers who have seen all of it are not reassured by the fact that the landscape looks intact, because they know what the silence means. Florida's wildlife agencies have not been passive about the python problem. That is important to establish clearly, because the story of the response is its own kind of revelation. Python elimination programs have existed in various forms since the early 2010s. Trained removal specialists are licensed to hunt pythons year-round in state-managed lands. Annual competitions have been organized, the Florida Python Challenge, that mobilize hundreds of hunters across designated removal areas over short, intensive periods. The results of those efforts, measured honestly, are instructive. The 2023 Python Challenge, one of the largest organized removal efforts ever conducted, produced 209 pythons removed over a 10-day period. The event was covered extensively, described in headlines as a major effort to address the crisis. 209 animals, against a population estimated at 100,000 or more, spread across a landscape of 1.5 million acres, significant portions of which are accessible only by airboat and on foot through dense and dangerous terrain. The math is not encouraging. It is not that the removal programs are poorly designed or poorly executed. They are not. It is that the scale of what they are attempting to address has grown beyond what any removal program, operating at any realistic level of funding and staffing, can meaningfully reduce. The python population reproduces faster than the removal rate. The terrain protects them. The size of the landscape makes comprehensive removal effectively impossible with current methods. What the footage makes clear, and what researchers have been increasingly willing to say directly in public, is that the window for a removal-based solution may have already closed. Not because of negligence, though there was negligence in the early years when the population was smaller and the political will to address it was weaker, but because ecosystems do not wait for political cycles. They respond to present conditions. And the present condition is a system that has already been substantially reorganized. This is the finding that the footage forces into the open. The question is no longer whether the Everglades can be fully restored to its pre-Python baseline. That baseline may no longer exist as a reachable target. The question that researchers are beginning to ask instead is what a stable, functioning Everglades looks like with pythons as a permanent part of it, and whether there is a version of that outcome that preserves enough of the original system to be worth calling preservation. That is a very different conversation than the one that was happening even 5 years ago. There is a second layer to the footage story that has received almost no attention outside of specialized conservation circles. The cameras that documented the python saturation were also documenting something else, simultaneously, something that the python problem had effectively masked because it was happening at a slower pace and a quieter volume. The vegetation structure across significant portions of the interior Everglades is changing. The sawgrass prairies that define the iconic visual identity of this ecosystem are not static. They are maintained in their current form by a combination of fire, hydrology, and the foraging and physical activity of the animals that live within them. Remove those animals. Alter the hydrology, as has been happening for decades through water management infrastructure. Reduce the fire management that historically shaped the system. Do all of those things simultaneously. The plant community responds. Invasive plant species, Melaleuca, Brazilian pepper, Old World climbing fern, that have been aggressively managed for years are now being documented expanding into areas where they had previously been suppressed. Not because the management programs have stopped, but because the conditions that previously limited their spread have changed. The browsers and foragers that once kept those species in check are gone. The hydrology that made certain soils inhospitable to invasive trees has shifted. The fires that cleared and reset vegetation patterns are being managed for human safety in a landscape increasingly bordered by development. The result, documented in the new footage and in concurrent ground surveys, is a system undergoing what ecologists call a regime shift. Not a single dramatic event. A quiet, distributed reorganization where one stable ecological state is replaced by a different one. And regime shifts, once they pass a certain threshold, do not reverse on their own. The threshold question is the one that no one in conservation management wants to be the person to answer publicly. Because answering it honestly means acknowledging something that is difficult to communicate to a public that has been told for decades that restoration is working. Restoration has been working. Billions of dollars in federal and state funding have gone into the comprehensive Everglades restoration plan, the largest environmental restoration project ever attempted in the United States. Genuine progress has been made on water quality and water flow in certain areas, and simultaneously, in the sections of the system that those restoration dollars cannot reach, the interior, the remote marsh, the areas where the cameras caught what no model fully predicted, something else has been happening. The two stories are both true, and the fact that both are true at the same time is precisely why the footage is as significant as the people who first reviewed it understood it to be. There is a version of this story that ends with a call to action. Sign a petition. Donate to a conservation fund. Support legislation. That version of the story is not wrong. Those things matter, and there are people doing genuinely important work who need resources and public support. But that is not the full story that the footage tells. And telling the shorter version would be doing the same thing to this story that got the Everglades into this situation in the first place, making it smaller and more comfortable than it actually is. The full version of this story is about what happens when a complex system is altered incrementally, never in a single dramatic event that creates an obvious before and after, always in small adjustments that seem manageable in isolation, until the accumulated weight of those adjustments reaches a point where the system can no longer return to what it was. The Everglades did not break on a single day. There was no single decision, no single actor, no single moment that you could point to and say, here. This is when it changed. It broke the way most things break, slowly, then faster, quietly, until it was loud. The pythons are not the cause of this. They are the most visible symptom of a longer process. A system under enough stress, with its hydrology altered, its mammal populations diminished, its fire regime disrupted, its borders pressed up against one of the fastest-growing metropolitan areas in the United States, does not have the resilience to absorb an invasive apex predator the way a healthy system might. The pythons thrived because the conditions for their thriving had been building for decades before the first one was released. What the footage captures is the convergence of all of those processes into a single visible moment, a landscape that looks from above like it always has, that shows green from a drone, that has water moving through it and birds in the trees, but that, at the level the cameras can actually see, is operating in fundamental silence where there used to be a full, dense, layered world of life. The researchers who reviewed the footage and chose to share it publicly understood what they were doing. They were not releasing a nature video. They were releasing a document, evidence of a threshold that may already have been crossed, preserved on sensor and hard drive by equipment that was not placed there to find this, but that found it anyway, because the Everglades does not care whether we are ready for what it has to show us. It simply keeps moving, slow as it has always moved, 1/4 mile per day, in a direction we did not choose and may not be able to redirect. The cameras are still out there. They are still recording, and the next footage will not be easier to watch than this one.